She was mocked for coming to her sister's wedding alone, until a Mafia boss say to her, "You are with me now." "She's alone," someone murmured. Didn't her fiancé leave her? Around her, people smiled too sweetly, whispered too loudly. Their glances slid over her like silk and knives. Aaliyah forced a small smile, pretending not to hear. She folded her napkin carefully, as if neatness could protect her dignity. Across the room, her sister spun in her new husband's arms, laughing, radiant. Aaliyah was happy for her. She really was. But happiness for someone else didn't stop the sting in her own chest. Hello, family. Welcome. If you've ever been judged for standing alone, this story is for you. You're not invisible here. You're part of a community that stands for dignity, courage, and quiet strength. Subscribe if you believe in fairness and in stories that remind us we all deserve to be seen. At the next table, Raphael, her ex, laughed a little louder than necessary. His new girlfriend leaned against him, radiant in red. Their fingers intertwined under the tablecloth, deliberate, taunting. Aaliyah caught his smirk as he glanced her way, the same expression he'd worn when he said she wasn't exciting enough. She looked away quickly, staring at the roses in front of her. The scent was heavy, almost suffocating. She wished she'd stayed home. But she had promised her sister she'd come, promised to smile, to keep things normal. Normal, though, felt impossible when everyone in the room seemed to be watching her fall apart quietly in a designer gown. The music swelled. Couples filled the dance floor, laughter ringing through crystal chandeliers. A waiter passed, offering champagne. Aaliyah took a glass, but her hand trembled slightly. She set it down untouched. That's when she felt it, a gaze, steady and unflinching. Across the ballroom, a man sat at a table near the back. He wasn't laughing like the others. He was watching her. His suit was black, impeccably tailored, his expression unreadable. Tattoos climbed just above the edge of his collar, like art half hidden by restraint. He didn't belong to this glittering crowd. He looked like danger wrapped in quiet elegance. Arian Martino. She'd heard the name whispered earlier. Some said he owned half the city's ports. Others said he owned half its silence. Whatever the truth, no one dared go near him. Even from across the room, his presence seemed to tilt the balance of the air. Aaliyah looked away, embarrassed. Men like that didn't look twice at women like her. She turned back to her plate, pretending to text anyone so she wouldn't look as lonely as she felt. A group of cousins passed behind her, giggling. One whispered, "Poor Aaliyah. Can you imagine? Coming alone after that breakup." They thought she couldn't hear. They were wrong. She pressed her hands together, inhaled deeply. "Don't cry. Not here." The music changed again. A slow waltz filled the room, soft, romantic. Couples stood, drifting toward the dance floor. Her sister and brother-in-law moved gracefully among them, perfect and glowing. Aaliyah stayed seated, pretending to scroll through her phone. Her ex passed by with his girlfriend, their movements deliberately close, intimate. He looked down at her for just a second, enough to twist the knife. And then she heard a voice beside her. Low, steady, and commanding enough to slice through the music. "You're with me now." She froze. Slowly, she looked up. Arian Martino stood beside her table, one hand extended, his gaze locked on hers. Excuse me," she stammered, uncertain if he was joking. He leaned closer, his tone softer but unyielding. "They've had their show. Now let's give them something worth watching." Her breath caught. Around them, heads began to turn. The room seemed to fall into a hush that pulsed with curiosity. Aaliyah hesitated, her heart pounding. Then, before she could think too hard, she placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, solid, grounding. He guided her toward the dance floor. Every step was a statement. The whispers followed like ripples in water. The music wrapped around them. He placed one hand lightly on her waist, the other guiding her with quiet precision. She moved stiffly at first, nervous, aware of the dozens of eyes watching. But Arian's calm didn't falter. His gaze held hers, steady, patient. "Breathe," he murmured. "You're not the one who should be ashamed." Something in the way he said it, simple, assured, made her chest tighten. Her ex froze mid-spin, his smug expression faltering as he saw who she was dancing with. The same guests who had whispered pity now stared in stunned silence. Aaliyah felt the shift. For the first time that night, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't pitted. She was seen. They moved slowly, almost effortlessly, though she hardly knew how to dance. His hand stayed firm at her back, steadying her through every step. When she stumbled, he caught her, a faint smirk touching his lips. "You're fine," he said quietly. "You were never the problem. Ever been underestimated until you showed your strength? Subscribe now." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said that to her before. When the song ended, he didn't release her hand immediately. Around them, people tried to act casual, but the tension was thick as fog. Arian's gaze swept the room once, cool, indifferent, before returning to her. He inclined his head slightly. "You handled that well." Aaliyah blinked. "Handled what?" "Their judgment." He glanced at her ex, whose face was pale now, his girlfriend looking uneasy. "You gave them something to remember." She exhaled shakily. "I didn't do anything." "Exactly." His lips curved faintly. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. Before she could reply, a little commotion erupted near the bar, someone calling for more champagne. Arian stepped aside, motioning her back toward her table. She sat, unsure whether to thank him or pretend it hadn't happened. But when she glanced up, he was still there, watching her as if trying to decide something. Finally, he gave a small nod and turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Aaliyah sat frozen, heart racing, every thought tangled. The same people who had whispered behind their hands were now pretending not to look. Her ex avoided her eyes entirely. She pressed her fingers to her pulse, feeling it thrum beneath her skin. Whatever just happened had changed something in the air, something she couldn't name yet. That was the night the whispers stopped. The night power stood beside pain, and everything shifted. Hours earlier, Aaliyah had rehearsed her smile in the mirror, telling herself it would be fine. Just one evening, one night to celebrate her sister. But heartbreak had its own timing. And when she walked into that ballroom, she had no idea she was about to collide with a man whose world would rewrite hers forever. The music shifted again, softening into a waltz that swept through the room like a silk curtain. The chatter dimmed, replaced by the slow rhythm of strings and piano. Couples drifted toward the dance floor, hands linking, eyes meeting, smiles polished for the camera flashes waiting to catch them. Aaliyah stayed seated, her pulse still unsteady from the first dance. She'd returned to her corner table, hoping to blend into the candlelight. But her heartbeat wouldn't settle. The memory of Arian's hand around hers, firm, unhurried, still lingered. He had disappeared into the crowd, but his presence hadn't. The air still felt changed, charged somehow. Her champagne glass sat untouched before her, beads of condensation trailing down its stem. She glanced toward the head table, where her sister and new husband were dancing, radiant and oblivious. Love looked easy for them, effortless. Maybe that was the difference between those who were chosen and those who were left behind. Her eyes flickered across the room, just once, by accident, and stopped. Arian was standing near the bar, a glass of something dark in his hand. He wasn't watching her this time. He was talking to two men in suits, both older, both deferential. But even in conversation, he seemed to command the space he occupied. People instinctively gave him distance. Even laughter around him was quieter, like the room itself feared breaking his focus. Then, as if pulled by instinct, his gaze lifted, and found hers. Aaliyah froze. It wasn't a long stare, not even deliberate. But it felt like gravity shifted, pulling her back to that dance floor where everything had stopped. She looked away first, embarrassed by how aware she suddenly was of her own breathing. Across the room, her ex Raphael twirled his new girlfriend with showy confidence. They were laughing too loudly, as if trying to reclaim the attention they'd lost earlier. Aaliyah's stomach tightened. The room's whispers had dulled, but not disappeared. She could feel them, small glances, half-smiles, people trying to decode her connection to Arian. She didn't know the answer herself. She reached for her phone again, a nervous habit, scrolling aimlessly just to anchor herself. But before she could look down, a shadow fell over the table. Still hiding. The voice was low, familiar. Aaliyah looked up. Arian stood beside her once more, the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. She blinked, startled. I'm not hiding. Just sitting. Same thing. He rested one hand on the back of her chair, leaning slightly closer, not invasive, just enough to make the world around them fade. The scent of his cologne, subtle and expensive, brushed the edge of her senses. You didn't tell me your name, he said. She hesitated. Aaliyah. He nodded once. Arian. I know. That earned her a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. Do you? I've heard people whisper, she admitted softly. You make them nervous. His lips curved faintly. That's usually the point. Aaliyah tried to smile, but her pulse spiked. And what about me? Should I be nervous too? He considered her for a moment before saying, No, you already were. The rest of them don't matter. She looked down at her hands. They'll start whispering again. Then give them something better to whisper about. Before she could ask what he meant, he extended his hand toward her again, unhurried, expectant. Her breath caught. What are you doing? Finishing what we started, he said simply. You're with me now. The same words, delivered softer this time, but with the same weight. For a moment, the room blurred. She could hear her heartbeat louder than the orchestra. Slowly, almost in disbelief, she placed her hand in his. As soon as she did, the room reacted, the collective inhale, the ripple of attention. The chandeliers reflected across the polished floor as Arian led her forward, every stride controlled, deliberate. People shifted subtly to make space, their murmurs trailing behind like waves. He stopped at the center of the dance floor. The musicians caught the cue and let the melody swell, a soft waltz, lush and cinematic. His hand found her waist, steady and warm. Her other hand rested against his shoulder, trembling slightly. Look at me, he said quietly. Aaliyah met his gaze, uncertain. There's no one else here, he murmured. Just music. Forget them. So she tried. At first, she moved awkwardly, conscious of her every step. But Arian's movements were calm, assured, his strength guiding without forcing. He led with subtle pressure, never breaking eye contact. Each step seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat until the world outside that circle of light simply vanished. The room faded. The whispers faded. It was only the music, the warmth of his hand, the way his gaze held hers like a promise. Her breath steadied. Her body followed his lead, and before long, the rhythm became effortless. She hadn't danced in years, not since college, but it came back to her like muscle memory. Only this time, there was no performance, no pretense. Better, Arian said quietly. Aaliyah smiled faintly. You're a demanding teacher, only with people who can keep up. She laughed softly, surprising herself. The sound felt strange, new. When she turned her head slightly, she caught Raphael's expression from across the room. He had stopped dancing. His girlfriend looked confused, trying to pull his attention back, but he couldn't look away. His smirk was gone, replaced by something sharp and uncertain. Aaliyah didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Arian had said it earlier. Sometimes silence was the loudest answer. The song stretched on, graceful and slow. Arian twirled her once, his hand firm against her back as he caught her easily. Her pulse spiked again, not from fear but from the strange electric tension that sparked in the brief space between them. When she looked up, their eyes met again, closer this time. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his thumb brushing lightly over her fingers before saying, Because you needed someone to remind them who you are. She blinked. You don't even know me. His gaze softened slightly. Maybe I don't have to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music filled the silence between them, thick and intimate. As the final notes faded, Arian slowed their steps, his hand lingering at her waist. Around them, applause broke out, scattered at first, then more confident as people pretended they hadn't been staring. Arian inclined his head slightly, never taking his eyes off her. "Now you can breathe." Aaliyah realized she had been holding her breath the entire time. She exhaled shakily. He led her off the floor, not releasing her hand until they reached her table again. She sat, her pulse still fluttering. He didn't sit beside her but stood close enough for the scent of his cologne to still linger. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "No. But I wanted to." "Why?" Arian's gaze flicked across the room. "Because power only matters when it's used right." The words sank deep, though she wasn't sure she understood them fully. Her ex brushed past their table a moment later, avoiding Arian's stare but throwing her a look of barely contained irritation. Arian didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, a silent challenge that made Raphael look away immediately. When Raphael was gone, Arian leaned down, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "He's the kind of man who confuses cowardice for charm. Don't waste your breath remembering him." Aaliyah blinked. "How do you know him?" "I don't. But I know his type." There was no arrogance in his tone, just certainty. The kind that came from seeing too much. He straightened again, eyes sweeping the room once more. "You'll be fine tonight," he said. "They've had their entertainment. They'll move on." Before she could respond, one of the men from earlier approached, gray-haired, cautious. "Mr. Martino," he said quietly. "They're ready for you in the West Hall." Arian nodded, then turned back to Aaliyah. "Will you be all right?" She nodded automatically. "Yes." He studied her for a long moment, as if confirming it for himself. Then softer he added, "If anyone bothers you, tell them you're still with me." She almost laughed. That's a dangerous sentence to say out loud. His smirk deepened slightly. "That's the point." And just like that, he was gone again, crossing the room with a stride that made space open around him. Aaliyah sat still, her heartbeat refusing to settle. She looked around. The guests were pretending to talk, pretending not to watch her. But something had changed. The glances were no longer pitying. They were cautious, curious. She picked up her champagne glass and finally took a sip. It was crisp, cold, and somehow lighter now. Her sister passed by a moment later, beaming. "Aaliyah, you looked amazing out there." "Who was that?" "Just someone who didn't like seeing me sit alone," she said carefully. Her sister grinned, clearly intrigued. "Well, he certainly made an impression. Half the women here are whispering about him." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "Half the men too, probably." When her sister was pulled away again, Aaliyah let herself lean back in her chair. For the first time that evening, she felt the tension ease from her shoulders. She looked toward the doorway where Arian had disappeared. He hadn't asked for her number, hadn't hinted at anything beyond what he'd done. It wasn't about attraction, or maybe it was, but not in the way most people would think. It was something quieter, something deeper. Respect, maybe. Recognition. Aaliyah wasn't sure. But she knew one thing. When he had said, "You're with me now," it hadn't felt like ownership. It had felt like safety. She stayed at the table for a while longer, finishing her drink as the night wound down. The laughter softened, the crowd thinned. When she finally stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights flickered beyond the hotel courtyard. The sound of engines and distant music drifted faintly on the breeze. Aaliyah paused at the edge of the marble steps. She exhaled, her breath visible in the crisp air, and smiled faintly to herself. For the first time in months, she didn't feel small. She didn't know what would come next, or if she'd ever see Arian again. But the memory of his voice lingered in her chest, low and certain. "You're with me now." She whispered it softly under her breath, not as a promise, but as a reminder. Tonight, she'd borrowed his strength. Tomorrow, she'd begin to find her own. The night air outside the ballroom was cooler than Aaliyah expected, carrying the faint scent of rain and cut roses from the garden terrace. She leaned against one of the marble pillars, her fingers brushing the edge of her clutch as she exhaled, finally letting her smile fall away. Inside, Laughter still spilled through the open doors, brittle and sharp, but distant now. She had survived the night. Barely. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't finished. Behind her, the heavy doors opened again. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. There was a quiet command in Arian's presence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. "You disappeared," he said softly. "I needed air." "Understandable." His voice was lower now, gentler than before. "You handled that room better than most people would." Aaliyah gave a faint, humorless laugh. "By standing still and pretending not to care?" "By not breaking," he corrected. She turned, studying him under the soft glow of the courtyard lights. His expression was composed, but his eyes, gray intense, watched her like he was searching for something he couldn't name. "You've been through worse," he said quietly, almost to himself. Aaliyah frowned. "You say that like you know me." For a heartbeat, he didn't answer. Then, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe I've just learned to recognize strength that hides behind silence." Her gaze dropped, embarrassed by how his words seemed to land too close to the truth. "People have a lot to say about you, Mr. Martino," she said softly, testing the name. He tilted his head. "People have a lot to say about everyone. Doesn't make it true. And yet they whisper," she murmured. Arian's eyes flicked toward the ballroom entrance, where two men in suits had just exited. His men, she realized. They lingered a short distance away, pretending not to watch. "They whisper," he said, "because they need something to fear. It makes them feel safe." Aaliyah studied him for a moment. There was a weight behind his words, something she couldn't quite untangle. She wanted to ask more, but the sound of familiar laughter cut through the quiet. "Raphael." He stepped out into the courtyard, his tie loosened, his drink half full. His smile was sharp, insincere. "There you are," he said. "I thought you'd slipped away again." Aaliyah straightened, her stomach nodding. "What do you want, Raphael?" He shrugged, feigning innocence. "Just checking if you're enjoying yourself. Quite the scene you made out there. You and your new friend." She stiffened, her voice clipped. "It wasn't a scene. It was a dance." "Sure." His eyes darted toward Arian, who stood slightly behind her, silent and still. "And what are you now, huh?" "His charity project. Mafia Martino and his latest good deed." Aaliyah's cheeks burned. She opened her mouth, but Arian's voice came first, low, measured, and cutting through the tension like glass. "Be careful." Raphael turned, his smirk faltering. "Excuse me." Arian stepped forward slowly, the distance between them shrinking until the air itself seemed to thicken. "You're drunk," Arian said calmly, "and I'm patient. But both of those things have limits." Raphael's jaw tightened. For a second, it looked like he might say something reckless. But when Arian's gaze met his, cold, unwavering, he swallowed hard instead. "You don't scare me," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. Arian didn't smile. "Then try harder." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Raphael took a step back, muttered something under his breath, and turned toward the ballroom. His retreat wasn't graceful, but it was quick. When he was gone, Arian exhaled slowly, turning back to Aaliyah. "You shouldn't let people like that get close enough to hurt you." Aaliyah forced a smile. "He already did." Arian's expression softened for the first time that night. "Then stop letting him take up space he doesn't deserve." She looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "You make that sound easy. Nothing worth keeping ever is." They stood in silence for a moment. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the horizon, soft but promising rain. Arian glanced toward the parking lot. "Let me walk you to your car." "That's not necessary," she said quickly. "I'm fine." His eyes met hers. "You don't have to accept protection," he said evenly. "Just don't pretend you don't need it." Aaliyah hesitated, then nodded. They walked together through the garden path toward the row of parked cars. The air was heavy now, the wind carrying the faint scent of approaching rain. She stopped beside her car and turned to him. "Thank you," she said quietly. For whatever that was back there. He studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. You don't owe me thanks. Just don't let them see you afraid. I'm not afraid, she lied. Good. He stepped back. Because fear is how they win. He started to turn away, heading toward the far end of the lot where a black sedan waited. But when Aaliyah reached for her keys, a soft mechanical click broke the quiet, her car refusing to start. She tried again. Nothing. She frowned, pressing the ignition a third time. The engine sputtered uselessly. Then she heard it, a low hum, the sound of another engine idling nearby. A black SUV sat 2 rows away, headlights dimmed but running. Arian's head turned instantly. His posture changed, sharp and alert. He walked back toward her in 3 quick strides. Get out of the car, he said quietly. Aaliyah blinked. What? Now. Something in his tone made her obey without question. She stepped out just as the SUV's headlights flared to life. For a moment, they blinded her, flooding the parking lot with harsh white light. Arian moved between her and the glare, his body a solid barrier. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even move toward the vehicle. He just stood there, still and deliberate, one hand slipping subtly into his jacket. The SUV hesitated, engine revving once, then reversed sharply, tires squealing as it sped out of the lot and disappeared into the night. Aaliyah's breath came fast, uneven. Who was that? Arian's eyes stayed on the empty road. Someone who made the mistake of thinking I was alone. He turned to her then, his voice softer. Your car's not safe tonight. I'll have someone take care of it. She wanted to argue, to ask questions, but something in his tone silenced her. Arian opened the back door of his sedan and gestured toward it. Come on, Aaliyah. I'll take you home. And for the second time that night, she found herself stepping into a world she didn't understand. Drawn by a man she should have feared, but somehow didn't. The door shut behind her with a quiet click. As the car pulled away, rain began to fall in soft, silver streaks across the windshield, washing the night clean, but not the questions it left be. The city slid past in a blur of lights and wet pavement. Rain tapped softly against the car windows as Arian steered through the near-empty streets, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the gearshift. His movements were calm, precise, controlled, even after what had just happened. Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence between them, heavy with everything neither of them was saying. She kept stealing glances at him, his sharp profile illuminated by passing streetlights, the faint reflection of red and gold flickering across his jawline. He didn't look afraid, not even unsettled. When the SUV had sped off, she'd expected him to call someone, to chase after it, to show the anger that must have been simmering beneath that composed exterior. But instead, he'd simply told his driver to leave, taken the wheel himself, and guided her into the car without a word. Now, every time the headlights of another vehicle swept past them, Aaliyah's heart jumped. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Do things like that happen to you often? Arian's eyes didn't leave the road. Not often, he said. But often enough to never be surprised. Aaliyah frowned. Who were they? His lips curved slightly, though not into a smile. People who mistake curiosity for courage. The car turned sharply onto a narrower street, the tires slicing through puddles. He moved through the maze of the city with the ease of someone who knew every hidden road, every shortcut. Within minutes, the distant hum of the SUV was gone. You're calm, she said after a moment. After what just happened. I don't see much point in panic, he replied simply. That's not normal. Arian glanced at her briefly. Neither am I. She didn't argue. Instead, she turned her gaze to the rain sliding down the window. Her reflection looked pale, small against the dark interior of his car. She tried to piece together what little she knew about him. His name, his control, the way the entire ballroom had seemed to obey his silence. Finally, she asked, Who are you really? For the first time, he smiled slow, deliberate, a little dangerous. A businessman. Aaliyah let out a small, disbelieving laugh. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters tonight. She turned toward him. And the people who mistook curiosity for courage, they know you too? His fingers drummed once against the steering wheel before stilling. They know better than to follow me twice. The tone of his voice left no space for further questions. Yet, beneath the intimidation, there was something else, a hint of weariness, perhaps, or restraint. The car slowed as they approached her neighborhood. The city here was quieter. Smaller buildings, yellow street lamps flickering through the mist. Arian parked just outside her apartment building, the engine idling softly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Aaliyah reached for the door handle, then stopped. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to. His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. You didn't ask for help. I offered it. But still, you didn't have to step in. At the wedding, I mean. Arian's expression softened, just slightly. Yes, I did. Her brows furrowed. Why? He turned fully toward her now, his voice dropping lower, each word deliberate. Because they thought you were an easy target. People like that only understand power when they see it. She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. You made them stop laughing. He studied her for a long moment. Then his hand brushed lightly against the edge of the steering wheel as he said, Next time they laugh, remember, people only mock what they envy. Aaliyah blinked, caught off guard. The words hung in the air between them, steady and grounding, like a thread pulling her out of the ache she'd carried for weeks. She nodded slowly, her voice soft. That's easier said than believed. You'll believe it, Arian replied. You already started to tonight. The rain had slowed to a drizzle now. The rhythmic patter against the windshield matched the quiet thrum of her pulse. She opened the door, stepping out into the cool air. The street was empty except for the dim flicker of a neon sign across the road. Arian leaned slightly toward her open window. Get some rest, Aaliyah. She smiled faintly. You too, businessman. His lips curved at the edges, amused, but he didn't reply. The door closed softly, and his car pulled away, the dark sedan disappearing into the rain-slick streets until its taillights became two faint red dots swallowed by the night. Aaliyah stood there for a long moment, her hands still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something else. Something she didn't quite have a name for. When she finally turned toward her building, she caught her reflection in the glass door. Her eyes looked different, clearer, steadier. Maybe she wasn't healed yet. Maybe she was just beginning. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel small. She whispered to herself, half a promise, half a challenge. Let them laugh. And as she disappeared into the warm light of the stairwell, the rain outside began again. Soft, persistent, cleansing. The morning light barely filtered through the cafe windows, but already the air was thick with whispers. Phones buzzed incessantly. Screens flashed with the same two images, Arian and Aaliyah, caught in an intimate moment at the wedding. The captions were cruelly speculative, casting shadows over every smile. Aaliyah's fingers trembled as she scrolled through them, each comment a sharp echo of the panic rising in her chest. Her sister's husband had called her twice, his voice low and urgent. Aaliyah, this man, he's dangerous. Stay away. You don't understand what you're getting into. She hung up, swallowing the knot of frustration and fear in her throat. Aaliyah's cafe, once a sanctuary filled with the rich scent of roasted beans and warm pastries, now felt like a stage. Every corner held a spectator. Every table seemed to host a critic. Customers whispered behind menus. Even familiar faces kept glances fleeting, nervous. And then there was Raphael. He appeared at the door like a storm, his presence sharp, his smirk sharper. So, he said, leaning casually against the counter. Your little hero? He's not real. Your imaginary savior. His eyes gleamed with malicious amusement, scanning the cafe as if daring someone to challenge him. Aaliyah stiffened, the memory of the night in the car burning in her chest. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words stuck, tangled in disbelief and unease. Before Raphael could continue, the bell above the door jingled again. Arian stepped in, moving with that quiet certainty that seemed to bend the air around him. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He just reached Aaliyah, placing a hand gently yet firmly on her shoulder. "She doesn't talk to trash." The words fell like a hammer. Silence cracked the cafe. Raphael's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening, and for a moment, Aaliyah saw him falter in a way she had never imagined. The room's energy shifted. All eyes, whether lingering on phones or darting from table to table, now followed Arian. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. Without another word, he let go of her shoulder, turned, and walked out. The door swung closed behind him with a muted finality. Aaliyah's hands shook, but not with fear. Something inside her had shifted. The power in the room had quietly rebalanced, and she felt it in her bones. For the first time since the photos leaked, she didn't feel exposed. She felt protected. Raphael lingered for another heartbeat before scowling and leaving, muttering under his breath. The cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the echoes of Arian's words hung in the air. Even the baristas moved with a touch more respect, and the customers seemed to sense that a boundary had been set, one not to be crossed. Aaliyah sat at her usual table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. The murmurs had faded into a distant buzz, replaced by a strange, new calm. She realized that gossip could stir fear, rumors could spread like wildfire, but some truths, some presences, could silence them all. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from her sister. "Are you okay?" Aaliyah stared at it, then typed back slowly. "I'm fine. More than fine." Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the subtle power shift that had just occurred within the walls of a small cafe. But Aaliyah knew. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the first flicker of a certainty she hadn't dared to trust before, that she was no longer alone, and that some battles didn't need to be fought with words. The next morning, Aaliyah's cafe hummed with its usual rhythm, but her mind was elsewhere. Arian's words from yesterday lingered like a shadow she didn't mind following. When her phone vibrated with a message from him. "Meet me. Quiet place." Coffeed, her heart stuttered for a beat, then steadied. She chose a small, dimly lit restaurant tucked between two office buildings. The kind of place where the chatter stayed low and strangers never lingered. When she arrived, he was already there, seated at a corner table, calm, composed, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Aaliyah," he greeted simply, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. She sat, unsure whether curiosity or caution was stronger. "You wanted to see me?" He nodded, eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on her. "I wanted to explain something." The waiter came and left, the clink of cups filling the brief silence. Arian leaned back, his hands folded loosely on the table. "I knew you once," he began. "Years ago." Aaliyah frowned, caught off guard. "I don't understand." "You were at the market," he said, voice low, almost reflective. "A crowded day. Everyone walking past, eyes averted. And you stepped forward, defended a child, stood up for someone without power." His gaze didn't waver. "I was there, hidden, watching." Her breath caught. The memory was faint, a blur of faces and noise and the sharp scent of fruit stalls. She hadn't thought anyone had noticed, let alone remembered. "You stood up for someone without power," Arian continued, "and that's not something you forget." Aaliyah's hands tightened around her mug. Why are you telling me this?" He leaned forward slightly, the air around him warm but deliberate. "Because you've always acted with courage, even when no one was watching. And yesterday, when things got complicated, I recognized that same courage. That's why I helped." It wasn't random, then. His intervention at the cafe hadn't been impulsive or convenient. It had been intentional. A repayment. Or perhaps, admiration. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, feeling a strange weight lift from her chest. "I never imagined someone would care about that moment." "I did," he said simply, as if the truth required no embellishment. "It matters. All of it matters. Loyalty, choices, who you decide to protect. It defines you." They talked then, quietly, deliberately, their voices blending with the soft hum of the restaurant. Arian spoke of loyalty, of the weight of promises, of lives lost in moments no one saw. Aaliyah shared stories of her own, small and large, of people she had tried to help and failed, of reputations she had guarded and lost. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions, just conversation that settled around them like a shield. Each story, each pause, built a bridge between them. "You know," Arian said after a long moment, "most people only see what's convenient. They ignore the quiet acts. But you make people remember what matters." Aaliyah smiled faintly, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "And you make people feel like someone's watching, even when they aren't." He shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Sometimes being seen is the strongest thing you can offer someone. The cafe and the gossip, the rumors and judgment, they began to feel distant, almost insignificant. Here, in this corner, with the faint clatter of cups and the low hum of conversation, Aaliyah understood something important. Arian's presence in her life wasn't a coincidence. Not yesterday, not in the past, not in this moment. As they finished their coffee, a quiet understanding settled between them. They would meet, yes, but cautiously, deliberately. Their conversations would be their own world, a space where loyalty and loss, reputation and courage could be spoken without fear of misinterpretation. Arian stood first, offering his hand briefly. "We'll talk again," he said. "There's more to understand, and I think we both need that." Aaliyah nodded, a warmth spreading in her chest she hadn't expected. "I think you're right." Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the fragile threads weaving themselves between two people in a quiet restaurant. But inside, a connection had been revealed, subtle yet unshakable, like a secret whispered through time and recognized at last. And Aaliyah, for the first time in days, felt the stirrings of something she had almost forgotten: trust. The calm that had settled over Aaliyah's life felt fragile, a thin glass stretched across an uncertain edge. That night, as she wiped down the cafe counters, the faint hum of the street outside shifted suddenly, an explosion of sound that made her heart leap. Glass shattered. The window beside the register splintered outward, shards skittering across the floor. A brick lay in the middle of the tile, heavy and menacing. Aaliyah froze, the cold realization sinking in. This wasn't random. This was a warning. By the time Arian arrived, the cafe smelled of fear and broken glass, and Aaliyah's hands were trembling with more than just anger. "Do you know what this is?" she demanded, voice sharp, eyes flashing as she picked up the brick. This is your war. And now my cafe is part of it." Arian stepped inside quietly, his gaze sweeping the damage, then resting on her. "I'm sorry," he said, the words measured, almost too calm. "But you're not the target. You never were." Aaliyah's laugh was hollow. "Not the target. Arian, a brick just crashed through my window. This is my life, and now it's collateral." He approached, slow, deliberate, closing the space between them. "You don't get to save me if it costs me peace," she said, her voice breaking with a mix of fear and fury. "You don't get to pull me into something I didn't ask for." Arian stopped a step away, eyes dark, unyielding. "And you don't get to run when things get real," he replied. His voice was firm, but beneath the surface, there was an unspoken weight, a truth that he carried quietly, even when the world pressed in. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them crackled, charged with unvoiced thoughts. Then Aaliyah's hands shook as she gestured toward the shattered window. "Do you even understand what you're doing to me? My life, my family, my cafe. Everything is in your shadow now." Arian's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what it means. And I didn't ask for it either. But hiding doesn't make the danger disappear. Facing it, together, that's how it ends." Her anger flared. "Together? You call this together? My life is bleeding into yours, Arian. You don't get to dictate the cost of my peace." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating in its intensity, yet grounding. "I don't want to dictate. I want to protect. But protection isn't always neat. It isn't always safe. And sometimes, the world doesn't give us the luxury of peace before reality arrives. The argument hung in the air like smoke, thick and inescapable. Pride clashed with fear. Attraction collided with resentment. Aaliyah felt it, the pulse of emotion she couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. She hated the danger he brought, yet the pull he exerted was undeniable. "You don't get to decide who gets hurt," she said finally, her voice low but trembling. "I won't be a part of this if it's going to destroy everything I care about." Arian's gaze softened, just slightly, enough for her to see the man behind the storm. "And I don't expect you to. But trust isn't about safety. It's about faith. Faith that we face what comes, together or not." Aaliyah stared at him, the weight of his words pressing against the fear coiling inside her. He had saved her once, and she had felt that surge of power, of certainty, of someone willing to stand between her and chaos. But this was different. This was not just a choice anymore. It was a demand on her courage. The room was silent except for the soft clink of glass fragments underfoot. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the danger lurking in shadowed streets, to the silent threats tracing bloodlines and vendettas. Inside, two people faced each other, raw and unguarded, each recognizing a spark of something they couldn't yet define. Finally, Aaliyah exhaled, a mixture of frustration and reluctant acceptance. "I can't promise you I won't be scared," she admitted. "I can't promise I won't fight against it when it's too much. But I won't run either." Arian's lips curved, almost imperceptibly, a quiet victory not in defiance but in understanding. "Then we start there. Fear and all. Together." And in that fragile, dangerous moment, beneath the anger and the tension, something deeper took root. Trust. Not blind, not easy but real. A bond forged in shadows, in threats, in the undeniable truth that the world could crumble around them, and yet they would stand. As Arian helped her move the larger shards of glass, Aaliyah realized something surprising. The chaos he brought didn't erase her strength, it sharpened it. The danger might surround them, but it could not define her. And in that clarity, she saw the first flicker of something else, an unspoken connection, resilient and steady, growing between them, even amid the bloodlines and shadows closing in. Days stretched thin, each one heavier than the last. Arian's world, already crowded with threats, began to spill into the public sphere. A rival family, cunning and ruthless, had launched a smear campaign, flooding social media and local news outlets with accusations of corruption, cruelty, and illicit dealings. The headlines were harsh, the words calculated to wound, and the whispers that followed threatened to infect everything Arian had built. Aaliyah sat in the quiet of her apartment, scrolling through the reports. Her cafe had become her refuge, but even that seemed fragile now. She knew what people would think, what they already were thinking, yet the urge to act overrode caution. Arian had done so much for her, risked so much to protect her, and she could not remain silent while someone else sought to dismantle him with lies. Without a word to him, without hesitation, she reached out to a local news outlet. The next morning, her voice was on record, steady and clear. "He's not a saint," Aaliyah said into the camera, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her gaze was unwavering, her tone both firm and graceful. "But he's a man who protects what others destroy. He stands when others fall. He acts when everyone else walks away." The clip went viral. Comments flooded in, some skeptical, some supportive, but the courage behind her words resonated. Even those who had doubted Arian began to pause, to consider. Arian saw the news later that day. He stormed into her cafe without warning, the tension radiating from him like heat. Aaliyah, who had been arranging pastries, looked up, startled by the force of his presence. "You risked yourself," he said, voice low, sharp with anger and concern. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You could have." "I know exactly what I did," she interrupted, standing to face him. "And I wouldn't change it." Arian ran a hand through his hair, frustration and admiration warring in his eyes. "Aaliyah, this isn't a game. These people, these rumors, they're dangerous. You could have been targeted." She stepped closer, her voice calm but fierce. "You reminded me I had worth. Let me do the same for you. I've watched you stand against everything they've thrown at you. Now it's my turn to stand with you. To prove that some things, some people, are worth defending." He studied her, the storm in his expression softening into something quieter, almost reverent. The cafe felt suspended, caught between the hum of everyday life and the gravity of what was unfolding in that small corner. You're fearless," he said finally, almost a whisper. "And reckless. But more than that, you're remarkable." Aaliyah's lips curved into a faint smile, tired yet triumphant. "Fearless? Maybe. Reckless? Certainly. But I choose my battles. And this one, it's worth it." That night, the city sprawled beneath them in a mosaic of light, the streets glimmering like scattered jewels. Arian and Aaliyah walked in silence, the cool air settling around them, punctuated by distant car horns and the faint hum of nightlife. He stopped on a bridge overlooking the river, the reflection of the lights dancing on the water. Turning to her, he reached for her hand, not with control, but with a quiet certainty that had become their language. "You don't need me to prove your worth, Aaliyah," he said, his tone both gentle and unwavering. "But when power stands beside you, use it. Let the world see what we see." Aaliyah's fingers curled around his, her heartbeat steady yet rapid beneath his gaze. "I don't need anyone to validate me," she said softly. "But I trust you, and that matters. More than you know." Arian's eyes softened, and in that moment, the danger that had shadowed their days seemed distant, irrelevant. For a heartbeat, there was only them. Two people who had faced chaos, who had risked vulnerability, and who had emerged not weaker, but stronger, together. "I've seen you," he whispered, leaning closer. "The way you move through the world, the way you refuse to back down. And I can't ignore it. I can't ignore you." Aaliyah tilted her head, heart fluttering with a mixture of fear and desire. "And I can't ignore you either," she admitted, her voice barely above the night's hum. "But it's not just desire. It's respect. It's trust. It's recognition." Arian's hand slid from hers to her cheek, thumb brushing lightly, reverently, as though mapping the moment itself. "Then we recognize each other," he murmured. "Not as savior and protected, not as danger and civilian, but as equals, as partners in whatever comes next. Together." Aaliyah's breath hitched, and for the first time in days, she felt something more than adrenaline and fear. She felt clarity. The city lights reflected in her eyes, shimmering like the possibilities ahead. "Together," she echoed, the word carrying weight, courage, and commitment. And there, under the fragile glow of streetlights, amid the echo of rumors and threats, they allowed themselves a confession that was not spoken but lived. It was in the touch of a hand, the unspoken understanding in a gaze, the acknowledgement that they were no longer separate actors in a dangerous world. They were entwined, facing it side by side. Love, sharp and dangerous, had woven itself into trust, into equality. And as they stood above the city, the wind tugging at their coats and hair, both knew that the fight ahead would be perilous, but it would be theirs. Together. In the shadows of danger, among whispers of bloodlines and betrayal, a truth had emerged. Power, courage, and affection were not mutually exclusive. And for the first time, Aaliyah and Arian understood the full measure of what that meant. Not just survival, but recognition, respect, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it as one. Weeks had passed since the storm of threats and rumors. Aaliyah's cafe had regained its rhythm, customers returning with warm smiles and curious glances. Arian's presence lingered like a quiet shadow, protective, reassuring, but no longer consuming her days. Life, fragile and beautiful, had begun to settle into a new rhythm. Another family event loomed on her calendar. She had hesitated at first. Memories of laughter turned cruel, of whispers and mocking stares, yet she felt a quiet certainty pulling her toward it. Not as the scared girl who had once entered timidly, but as someone transformed, tempered by trials and emboldened by courage. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished floors. The scent of perfume and polished wood filled the air. Guests murmured and mingled, glasses clinking, but this time, Aaliyah entered alone. She wore a dress understated yet elegant, her posture confident, her gaze steady. Heads turned. There was no mockery in the room, only respect, a recognition she had earned through her own resilience. Whispers traveled quickly, but they were different now. Instead of scoffs and sneers, they carried admiration. People noted the calm radiance she exuded, the subtle strength in every gesture, every measured step. Aaliyah felt it, the difference between being seen as vulnerable and being seen as unshakable. Her younger cousin lingered near the back of the room, shrinking in the shadow of taller, louder family members, a reflection of Aaliyah herself years ago. She hesitated, unsure of where she belonged, eyes downcast, hands twisting nervously. Aaliyah's heart stirred at the familiarity, at the memory of her own awkwardness and fear. She walked across the room deliberately, each step measured, yet unhurried. Conversations hushed slightly as she passed, a ripple of acknowledgement trailing behind her. When she reached her cousin, the younger girl glanced up, startled by the gentleness and warmth in Aaliyah's eyes. Aaliyah crouched slightly to meet her gaze and offered a soft smile. "Come on," she said, her voice low, steady, and inviting. "You're with me now." The words were hers, no longer borrowed, no longer an echo of someone else's protection. They were earned, shaped by moments of courage, by standing tall in the face of danger, by learning that power could coexist with grace. The girl hesitated, then nodded, a flicker of trust lighting her eyes. Aaliyah offered her hand, and together they walked into the center of the room, shoulders square, heads held high. The shift in energy was palpable. It wasn't just Aaliyah's courage, it was the promise she carried forward, that no one who had ever been diminished needed to remain small. From across the room, Arian watched, his presence quiet but unwavering. He did not step in, did not offer a shield. He had taught her to stand for herself, to wield strength alongside trust, to carry power without fear. And now, watching her command the space with elegance and authority, he felt something he had long recognized but never interfered with: pride. Aaliyah's gaze swept the room, taking in faces that once doubted her, that once whispered cruelly. She felt no bitterness, only the calm assurance of someone who had faced the storm and emerged intact. She had been tested, shaped, and refined, and now her confidence radiated outward, unassailable. The younger cousin matched her pace, hesitant at first, but emboldened by the woman leading her. By the time they reached the center of the room, whispers had shifted from speculation to admiration. Aaliyah's quiet strength, tempered by grace and experience, had drawn everyone into its orbit. For a moment, Aaliyah allowed herself to breathe, to feel the fullness of her transformation. The pain, the fear, the humiliation, all of it had built something enduring, a sense of self that no gossip, no threat, no mockery could undo. She had walked alone, but never without purpose. She had claimed her place, her power, her dignity, and now she could extend it to others. Arian finally stepped forward, unobtrusive, a small smile touching his lips. There was no need for words. The mutual recognition was enough. Their bond had grown through danger and trust, through courage and conflict. And in that bond, Aaliyah found another kind of strength. The knowledge that she could face the world, not just as a survivor, but as a woman who knew her worth and was willing to protect it. As the night carried on, Aaliyah guided her cousin through the room, showing her the small acts of courage she had learned to master. The tilt of a chin, the calm steadiness of a hand, the subtle confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. Every gesture was a lesson in resilience, every smile a reminder that dignity could be reclaimed. When the event wound down, and the crowd thinned, Aaliyah stepped outside into the cool night. The city lights shimmered, echoing the quiet triumph within her. She breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of life, the rhythm of her own strength, and the echo of lessons earned through struggle. If you've ever risen from humiliation, if you've built your strength from pain, Aaliyah's story is for you. Her journey, from whispers and mockery to respect and command, is a reminder that courage, resilience, and self-worth are forged in fire. And she smiled, knowing the story wasn't just hers. It belonged to anyone who had ever walked alone, to anyone who had felt small, unseen, or unheard, and had chosen to rise anyway. If you've ever risen from humiliation and built your strength from pain, subscribe, she thought, quietly but firmly. Because stories like this belong to people like us. And with that, Aaliyah walked into the night, radiant, confident, unshakable, the woman who had walked alone, and yet carried others with her, all the while defining what it meant to stand, unafraid, in the light.